So what are the responses to climate change, especially in terms of how can we adapt? I would like to suggest that adaptation is a process of unfolding and changing livelihoods. It's a process of communities migrating to different parts of the world due to rising sea levels, due to growing erratic rainfall, to drought, to other environmental factors. It's a process of displacement like we see in Bangladesh or the islands of the Pacific that are disappearing underwater as we speak. It's a process of adaptation that is not silent, but also it's a struggle. Violence and conflict are unfolding. So what is that doing to climate change adaptation patterns in the statutory and the customary tenure system? The challenge for us is to learn thus how statutory and customary systems are changing and adapting to climate change. So let's look at a couple of more examples and what you and I can do as citizens of the world to adapt to these unfolding conditions. I would like to suggest that you and I need to develop a theory of change around climate and the interface with tenure. It's a very difficult task. But if we don't have a conceptual model of how to put together evidence and information about this impact of climate on property rights systems, we can't make sense out of the data that flows into us every day. So I'd like to be so bold as to say that I do have a bit of a theory of change, perhaps not too complex at all, but I'd like to suggest that as climate change is unfolding, we will be seeing an increase and also decrease in the value of resources because of climate change. As I've alluded to before, because of issues like expanding water, rising sea level, we are seeing in some areas of the world where land values are increasing, in other places they're decreasing. I'd like to suggest that when these values of resources change, land or other resources, oftentimes there will be contestation. Look for it in your reading. Look for it in your analysis. And two things can happen during that contestation. One is there can be a breakdown in tenure systems that leads to disputes, conflicts, and indeed violence. And we see that in many parts of the world, perhaps along the borders of the Sahara and Sahelian zones of Africa. But in other cases, that contestation creates new opportunities. The conflict creates possibilities of defining new rules for how resources can be used. And as the optimist I am, I do think that climate change is causing a redefinition of rules and not necessarily violence and breakdown in tenure systems. And that there's a process of negotiation occurring as we speak, as rules in the customary and the statutory system are evolving. We are seeing today modifications and adaptations of tenure regimes around the bundles of rights around natural resources. And sometimes land use policies implemented by government make a difference and help that process of negotiation and dispute resolution. Other times, state policies are hindrances and contribute, in fact, to contestation leading to conflict and outright violence. As we do this theory of change, though, we need to look very carefully at who are the winners and who are the losers as tenure systems evolve. I would argue that there are big winners in climate change, and I would argue that there's major losers. I would not suggest that the losers are always women, but there's degradations. Some women will win, some will lose. Some youth will gain from changes in tenure regimes, others will lose out. Some people who are vulnerable today may actually turn out to be in better shape in years to come, depending on how they adapt to climate change and depending whether they have the resources, the assets at this moment to adapt and change very rapidly to the evolving climate and to the evolving economy and to the evolving tenure relation. But what we should look at very carefully is how are these tenure issues going to express themselves in the decades to come. I'd like to argue again in a conceptual way that territories that humanity created in early history to protect their territorial access to resources, to protect their boundaries, to protect their nation states. There's going to be a struggle to hold on to those territories, to keep people out, and to control what's happening to the land and the resources people own. Territorial control of natural resources is the fundamental foundation upon which much traditional, indigenous, property rights systems, customary systems are built upon. We see these principles of territorial control and exclusion expressing themselves in politics all the time. We see the struggle for the devolution of authority to local communities trying to control their own territory. We see examples of local level rulemaking to manage those bounded spaces that communities are trying to manage and control. We see new rules emerging around the complex bundles of rights to natural resources. We see new inventions like land charters or bylaws to manage natural resources in the territorial confines of particular places, oftentimes small spaces around the world. We see the growing tendency for communities who have territorial control of their resources to negotiate with external actors like companies, firms, who are trying to acquire land and access to other resources, but who must now negotiate with people who are gaining rights to their territories, rights to negotiate, to build contracts, to enforce those contracts. That's an example of adaptation unfolding around territorial control of natural resources. So this is a set of characteristics, a set of realities that we will be seeing and reading about in the press, learning about in our daily lives as people at the bottom try to protect their resources and adapt to very, very rapidly changing environmental circumstances. Now, on the other hand, there's been a very long tradition of indicative planning by government to try to plan for the use of natural resources, to try to plan for economic development and economic growth, whereby the centralized state and the administrative institutions of that state try to manage problems by and for the people. We see statutory systems and rules emerging out of state attempts to control and manage resources and sometimes break the power of people who have territorial control. We see principles of facilitated access to all, the centralized authority vested in government. We see national spatial planning and regulations and simplifications of tenure systems. We see the standardization of land administration policies and practices to try to create uniform statutory systems governing access, use, and transfer of natural resources. We see the replacement of customary tenure with statutory. And I would argue that over time we are going to see a major conflict unfold, and we see it now, between the efforts of people to control their spaces locally and that of the state struggling to deal with massive land use changes in the face of climate change, and that this struggle is going to be the examples unfolding of the interface of climate change and tenures in decades to come. Let's look at the case study of Tanzania. We've all been looking at this through the course of this session. The costs of climate change on particular countries, as countries are trying to adapt, can be seen every time. Take the case study of Tanzania that you have been looking at in this course, of what's happening to human settlements in that country as major flooding from cyclones coming across the country with a growing frequency are having on urban populations. A large part of Tanzania's population is along the coast, and the coast is being plummeted by cyclones. People are having to flee lowland areas. The cost of infrastructure is very, very high. Infrastructures are being damaged by severe cyclones. Infrastructures are damaged and not always replaced, and many more other consequences are unfolding. So think a bit about what the costs of climate change are and how societies are adapting to this. What is Tanzania doing to try to respond to climate change? Are they building stronger and bigger roads? Are they building coastal dikes? Are they protecting the mangroves along the coast that serve such an important role to buffer the impact of storm surges? Are they trying to create new settlements away and outside of lowland areas? And who's winning? Who are the people that are gaining from increases in land value? Who are those that are losing? What are happening to the poorest of the poor, women with no access, youth who are struggling to advance but have few alternatives?